There are stories where survival means fighting, climbing, crawling, and then there are others, colder, quieter, where the body stops. But life doesn't. There are places on Earth where even the strongest men don't belong, where breathing feels like drowning in dry air, and a single mistake can cost you your life. One of those places is the summit of Mount Everest, and in May 1996, Beck Weathers found himself alone, half-blind, frozen, and presumed dead, trapped high above the clouds, with no reason left to believe he'd ever see the world again. Let's go back to the beginning. In the spring of 1996, commercial expeditions to Everest had become increasingly popular. Climbers with varying levels of experience were signing up for the chance to stand on the world's highest point, as long as they had the money to pay for it. That year, an American named Beck Weathers joined an expedition led by Rob Hall, a respected guide from New Zealand. Weathers was 49 years old, a pathologist by profession, and passionate about mountaineering. But he was also recovering from a recent eye surgery that could flare up in extreme altitude. The ascent started like many others. The team moved slowly through the familiar camps, acclimatizing as they climbed, eyes always set on the summit. But Everest is never predictable. On May 10th, several expeditions, including Rob Hall's and another led by Scott Fisher, attempted to summit at the same time. Delays piled up, bottlenecks formed near the top, and then the weather changed. The storm came fast and without mercy. Temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. In the so-called death zone, above 8,000 meters, the air holds only a third of the oxygen we breathe at sea level. It becomes almost impossible to think clearly, to move with strength, or to judge distance and direction. For some, that night would be their last. Beck Weathers had already begun to struggle before the storm hit. Just below the summit, his vision started to blur, a result of his eye condition reacting to the high altitude. Rob Hall told him to wait where he was while the others pushed forward. Weathers stood in the freezing wind for hours, alone, slowly losing body heat and hope. When Hall didn't return, another guide tried to bring him down. But by then, the storm was fully unleashed. Beck Weathers, confused and barely conscious, was left in a shallow snow pit, assumed to be beyond saving. No one expected him to survive the night, but somehow, he did. The cold that should have killed him kept him alive, slowing his metabolism to a crawl. He drifted in and out of consciousness, frostbite spreading across his hands, his face, his feet. At one point, he recalls seeing stars through the torn roof of his tent, a strange moment of beauty amid the pain. That image, and the thought of his family, anchored him to life. The next morning, when the storm finally cleared, the rescuers were shocked to find Beck Weathers still breathing. His face was blackened by frostbite, and his hands were stiff, twisted into claws. He couldn't speak, he couldn't move much, but he was alive. They moved him to Camp 4, a flat area just below the summit ridge, where others were already regrouping. There was little hope for him at that point. Helicopter rescues at such altitudes were thought impossible. The thin air makes it nearly impossible for rotor blades to generate lift. But the climbers around him couldn't bring themselves to give up. Then came one of the most daring rescue flights in the history of mountaineering. A Nepalese pilot named Madan K.C. volunteered to attempt what had never been done before, a helicopter extraction above 6,000 meters. Flying dangerously close to the limits of the machine, he managed to land and evacuate Beck Weathers to safety, a feat so rare and risky that it's still remembered as legendary. But survival came at a terrible cost. Weathers lost his right arm below the elbow. Every finger on his left hand had to be amputated. His nose, too damaged to save, was later rebuilt using tissue from his ear. His face and ears were disfigured by frostbite. His feet, though spared amputation, carry the scars of that night forever. And yet, he lived. In the weeks that followed, Beck Weathers became a symbol, not of failure, but of impossible endurance. His story circulated across newspapers, documentaries, and interviews. He later wrote a memoir titled Left for Dead: My Journey Home from Everest, where he recounts not just the physical agony, but the emotional transformation that followed. Weathers admitted that before Everest, he was living a life divided, always chasing something, always away. That night on the mountain stripped everything back to the core. It forced him to confront what mattered: his family, his purpose, his time. The psychological scars were as deep as the physical ones. He describes vivid hallucinations during the night he was left for dead, blurred dreams mixed with pain and fear. He remembers moments of peace too, the kind that come only when you're close to the end. And in the aftermath, he struggled with guilt, with depression, and with the surreal realization that he was still here, when so many others were not. 8 climbers died in the 1996 Everest disaster, including Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. Their deaths raised serious questions about commercial guiding and the risks of crowding on the mountain. But for Beck Weathers, the lessons were personal. He chose to leave medicine, to reconnect with his family, and to live a quieter life, one rooted not in conquest, but in presence. Today, Beck Weathers lives in Dallas, Texas. He still bears the marks of what happened. In his hands, in his face, in the way he speaks of time. He sometimes gives talks about his experience, not to relive the suffering, but to remind people of what the edge looks like, and what can happen when you come back from it. His story is not about triumph. It's not even about Everest. It's about survival, the raw kind, the kind that doesn't always make sense, that doesn't come with clean lessons or tidy endings. He wasn't the strongest climber. He didn't have the best gear, but he had just enough will, just enough memory, just enough breath to crawl back. And in that narrow space between death and life, something changed. Maybe that's what mountains do. They take you apart. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they give you back a piece of yourself you didn't know you were missing. There are moments when death seems inevitable. When the body gives up, the heart stops, and no breath comes out. And yet, somehow, life finds a way back. This is the story of 2 women, 2 bodies frozen by nature, silent and lifeless. And yet, both returned, not because they fought, but because biology, luck, and science bent the rules of what we thought was possible. Lengby, Minnesota, December 20th, 1980. It was a brutally cold night, minus 30 degrees Celsius, snow, ice, and a darkness so still you could hear your breath. Jean Hillyard, a 19-year-old college student, was driving back from a friend's house when her car skidded off the icy road into a ditch. She wasn't hurt, just stuck. Wearing a winter coat, thin gloves, and cowboy boots, she decided to walk. Her friend Wally Nelson lived about 3 kilometers away. In the cold, with snow beneath her and stars above, she walked. She never made it to the door. Just meters away from Wally's porch, she collapsed. Her body couldn't go further. The cold took over. She lost consciousness. And for the next 6 hours, Jean lay in the snow, completely exposed. Her skin froze. Her limbs stiffened. Her body temperature dropped to just 27 degrees Celsius. By morning, she was a frozen statue, her skin hard as wood, her eyes glassy, no pulse, no signs of life. Wally found her just before sunrise. He thought she was dead. She looked dead. He carried her inside anyway and called for help. At the hospital, doctors tried inserting IVs, but the needles snapped against her skin. They couldn't measure a heartbeat. One doctor said she was like a piece of meat out of the freezer. And yet, they didn't give up. Using heating pads, they slowly tried to warm her up. It took hours, and then, against every expectation, she began to breathe. She opened her eyes, she spoke. Her brain had survived, her organs too. Apart from some frostbite on her toes, she had no lasting damage. Jean recovered, she got married, had children, lived her life. She remembers none of it. No tunnel, no visions, no fear. As she put it, "It was like I fell asleep and woke up in the hospital." 2 decades later, another woman would face the same silence. But this time, the cold wasn't just outside, it was water, ice, a trap no one should survive. In May 1999, Anna Bogenholm, a 29-year-old Swedish radiologist, was skiing near Narvik, Norway. She lost control on a slope and crashed into a frozen stream. The ice broke. She fell in, head and torso submerged in freezing water. She was stuck beneath the surface, pinned between rocks and ice. Her friends held her legs, trying to keep her from sinking. She found a small pocket of air under the ice and managed to breathe. For 40 minutes, she held on. Then, her heart stopped. By the time rescue arrived, she'd been under for 80 minutes. No pulse. Skin pale and waxy. Pupils unresponsive. Her body temperature had dropped to 13.7 degrees Celsius, the lowest ever recorded in a human who survived. 2 doctors on the scene began CPR immediately. She was airlifted to Tromsø University Hospital. On board, her chest was compressed continuously, keeping blood and hope circulating. In the hospital, a team of over 100 medical staff worked to bring her back. They used a heart-lung machine to warm her blood outside her body, then reintroduce it slowly. After 65 minutes of warming, her heart beat on its own. She stayed on a respirator for 35 days, in ICU for months. At first, she was paralyzed from the neck down, but over time, with fierce rehabilitation, she recovered nearly fully. Anna remembers very little of the accident. No pain, no fear, just the aftermath. When she woke up, she cried. She feared she'd be permanently disabled, but she wasn't. Her case changed medicine. It proved that extreme hypothermia could preserve the brain if the patient was handled properly. Her story helped popularize therapeutic hypothermia, now used to treat cardiac arrest victims worldwide. Neither Jean nor Anna fought to survive. They didn't crawl through snow. They didn't signal for help. They didn't cling to life in some heroic final push. They were silent, still, frozen. It was biology that protected them, a slowing of the heart, a pause in the metabolism, a cold that didn't kill, but preserved. It was science that brought them back, and a bit of luck too. These aren't tales of courage in the face of death. There's something rarer, stories of life that returned when no one thought it could. So maybe the question isn't how strong the human body is. Maybe it's this: how far can life go before it finally lets go? If you find this story as haunting as we did, consider subscribing. We're just getting started. There are places on Earth where no one is meant to live, places where the cold doesn't just kill, it erases, where silence stretches so deep it can swallow a person whole. In 1921, Ada Blackjack, a young Inupiat woman from Alaska, found herself completely alone on a frozen island in the Arctic. For 2 years, she survived where 5 trained men had failed, and she did it not to prove anything, but simply to stay alive for the son who was waiting for her back home. The story begins with a strange expedition, one that, from the start, didn't feel quite right. Wrangel Island lies north of Siberia, locked in the ice of the Arctic Ocean. It's a barren place. No trees, no settlements, just wind, snow, and predators. In 1921, a Canadian explorer named Vilhjalmur Stephenson wanted to claim the island for Canada. He funded a mission led by 4 white men and 1 unexpected participant, Ada Blackjack, hired as a seamstress and cook. She was 23. She had no training in survival, no experience with rifles, nor with Arctic exploration. She was a single mother, and she needed the money. The plan was to spend 6 months on the island, hunt for food, and wait for a ship to bring them back. But from the beginning, things unraveled. Provisions were low, hunting failed, the weather closed in early, no ship came. By early 1923, 2 years had passed since the team had landed. The isolation was total. One of the men, Lorne Knight, grew ill, scurvy. The other 3 decided to cross the frozen sea toward Siberia on foot. They vanished without a trace. Ada stayed behind to care for Knight, whose health was deteriorating fast. She was the only one left. Knight died soon after, and Ada Blackjack became the last human being on Wrangel Island. She was now completely alone. The cold on Wrangel isn't just cold, it burns. Temperatures often fall below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Winds whip across the ice fields without resistance. And then there's the silence, the kind that's not peaceful but oppressive. No voices, no help, no idea if rescue would ever come. Ada had never been trained for any of this, but what she had was resourcefulness, patience, and a will not to die. She found ways to keep warm. She repaired a torn canvas tent with scraps of fabric and built barricades around her shelter to keep out the polar bears. She killed birds and Arctic foxes for food. She stretched out every resource the men had left behind. And perhaps most importantly, she kept a journal, writing daily, holding on to some sense of structure, some anchor in a world that had collapsed into white emptiness. She wrote down her routines, her fears, the condition of her shelter, the weather, the days she succeeded at hunting, and the days she failed. She slept with her rifle within reach, resting it above her bed, in case a bear came during the night. She once described how she had to move away from the body of night because the smell of decomposition was unbearable, and because scavengers were beginning to come. She was still respectful. She built a barrier around his body, but she also had to stay alive, and that meant focusing on her own survival every hour, every day. Through all of it, one thought kept her going: her son. Ada's son, Bennett, had tuberculosis. She had left him in a children's home in Nome so she could earn money for his care. Everything she did, every stitch she sewed, every bird she skinned, every time she braved the wind to check her traps, was done with one goal: to come home to him. She survived this way for over 2 years, not with technology, not with advanced training, but with determination, adaptability, and a quiet strength that no one had expected from her when the mission began. When the rescue party finally arrived in August 1923, they found a woman who had taught herself to shoot, to hunt, to navigate an Arctic landscape, and who had outlived everyone else on the expedition. Ada was skeletal, exhausted, but alive. The return to civilization, however, was not the relief one might expect. Back in Nome, rumors began to spread. Some accused her of cannibalism, despite the fact that there was no evidence and that Knight's body had been found intact, carefully wrapped and protected. The men who had funded the mission were looking for someone to blame, and Ada was an easy target. She was a woman, she was indigenous, and she had survived while others had not. The truth, though, couldn't be denied for long. Those who examined her journals, her shelter, and the remains of the camp knew what she had done, and what she had endured. Ada used the money she earned to bring her son back into her care and pay for his medical treatment. She remarried, had another child, and returned to a quiet life in Alaska. She rarely spoke publicly about what had happened. She gave a few interviews, but for the most part, she stayed silent. Not because she was ashamed, but because to her, survival hadn't been a story. It had been a necessity. In later years, historians would revisit her case. They would call her the female Robinson Crusoe. Others would describe her as one of the most remarkable survivalists of the 20th century. But for Ada, none of that mattered. She hadn't gone to Wrangel Island to become a legend. She had gone because she needed to feed her child. And when everything fell apart, she had done what no one else could. She endured. Today, Ada Blackjack is remembered as a symbol of quiet courage, a woman who never wanted to be a hero, but who became one simply by refusing to die. In an age where survival is often romanticized, where stories are shaped into dramas for screens and books, Ada's legacy is something else. It's the story of a person pushed to the edge, not by choice, but by circumstance, and who faced it with dignity, ingenuity, and love. Maybe that's what makes her story so rare. Not the danger, not the duration, but the silence. The silence in which she survived, and the silence in which she lived afterward. None of these people were supposed to survive, and yet they did. Not because they fought, but because something, biology, chance, or sheer silence, kept them here. Sometimes life doesn't ask permission.